was one of the worst parts of the city. The Stinky River was a dumping ground for carcasses of animals that were being processed for food. The canal was a nasty mess. The flooding existed in that area before a lot of the improvements there. The housing was horrendous. There were shacks there. It was an undesirable area of the city. And so that is common in cities all over the country as locations for African American communities. As the African American communities and others lived there and developed that area and worked in that area and built up that area, it became more desirable. It was a welcoming place for immigrants, Black immigrants, who were fleeing the South. It was where organizations were located that provided the help to these people. There were bowling alleys, learning places, churches, and people actually lived in apartments on the avenue. So it was more than just music. It was a whole community. I started as an intern on the Indiana Avenue when the recorder was located at 518 Indiana Avenue. So I was a teenager in high school then. My job would be to be a gopher. And so I would go for things that, the editors wanted. The Indianapolis Recorder was formed and organized in 1895 as a church newsletter, if you will. And it became a weekly newspaper that was very entrenched in the community. It operated from a front street, we call it, which was Indiana Avenue. And it was the go-to place for whatever was going on. And, that's where you went to find out information about the Black community. It was more than just a newspaper for the community. It was an institution that is now utilized to capture our history. Anyone who's doing any research about Black history in this city and even in this state will go to the recorder for that information.
Madam C.J. Walker was a great American success story, and specifically a great American Black woman success story. Born in Delta, Louisiana in 1867, first child in her family born free. Orphaned at 7, married at 14, a mother at 17, a widow at 20. Moved to St. Louis, worked as a washerwoman. Didn't seem like there would be any possibilities that her life would be any better. But she really was embraced by the women of St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church, who began to give her a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman. Madam Walker was attracted to Indianapolis because of the thriving Black business community along Indiana Avenue. So she intentionally moved here in 1910 because she knew that there were other businesses, she knew that this was a great transportation hub, and she had been welcomed into the community by the National Negro Business League chapter and by Bethel AME Church. When she arrived in Indianapolis in 1910, it was just as many African Americans prior to World War I were starting to migrate to cities where women wanted and needed economic independence. Not only had she become a millionaire, but she also employed thousands of women, helped them become economically independent, became a philanthropist, a patron of the arts, and a social justice advocate who contributed to the anti-lynching movement. The Madam C.J. Walker building has a theater, in part because Madam Walker loved movies. She filed a lawsuit against a downtown theater that she usually would go to, and when she went one day, they told her that she was going to have to pay 25 cents, even though the sign said 10 cents. And she said, well, why is that? And they said, well, colored people have to pay this amount of money. And so she came back to her office and she talked with her attorney, F.B. Ransom, and they sued the theater. And she had died in 1919, but when this building opened in 1927, there was a theater. Throughout the 1930s, 40s, 50s, the Walker Theater was the premier venue for Black theater, for Black movies, first-run movies as well, because Indianapolis had become a segregated city. It was a lovely place for people to be able to come, not just into the theater, but into the coffee pot, into the restaurant. into the drugstore, into the beauty school, into the beauty salon, into the NAACP office, a dentist's office, a doctor's office. So this building was the center of activity. It's really great that the city of Indianapolis embraces Madam Walker's legacy. And there are so many ways through awards and through events where Madam Walker's legacy is celebrated. Madam C.J. Walker was my great-great-grandmother, and I am her biographer. It really is such a joy to tell her story because it allows me to look at the arc of American history through the lens of a Black woman.
The Lockfield Gardens was a special place really recognized nationally as the feeder of Crispus Attucks and the people. Attucks was beginning to become recognized because of his athletics, but little is known that Attucks had some of the best scholars at that particular time in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, because of school segregation. The Senate YMCA was a pivotal point for Black interaction. Even my dad and a lot of the guys would go there and play basketball. I watched him play basketball when I'm 6, 7, 8 years old. In the Senate Y, it was like a balcony, and that's where we would run and go around and exercise. My fun with the Senate was, that's where I learned how to swim. It was for the whole community. It was for North, South, East, and West. All Blacks could gather there. They had a group, they were our thinkers. There were some preachers, there were some lawyers, there were some doctors, and they would bring out the cutting issues. You had the discussions around politics, elections, and discussions around Black businesses, because they had their Black business, and contractors. The Fall Creek Y was the place to interact and still maintain some kind of consciousness tied into the avenue. But that changes. All of a sudden, when you hit the 80s, give it up.
Fall Creek is in trouble, primarily because of where its location is, right next to IUPUI. Some of the monies that we were getting in the past, have subsided. Matter of fact, the Black community is in trouble. And there's a possibility that it could be lost by default if Blacks don't take the initiative.
Bethel was a rich historical reality that saw oppression and understood oppression in the city of Indianapolis, where many people would not talk about what they know about the whole culture of Indianapolis. That church went through some unique transitional educational experiences because it wasn't first called Bethel. It was first just a church name on a street, but it was organized and some of the work was assisted through the Bishop Allen, the founder of AME. The architect did not have what I would call the Indianapolis style. How they constructed it, I could be suspicious, was it also had secret places that was very helpful because it was most important in helping slaves at that time get to Canada. There was another church not too far from it that was helpful in the Underground Railroad. Bethel AME became a foundation of the presence of religious ministry that was secular and sacred, and all became one. Never competing. The sacred and the secular was a oneness that they had laid, particularly in those early years. There wasn't no AME churches, Baptist churches everywhere. They were in little locations. Fortunately, Bethel just happened to be where ended up downtown was the development.
Indiana Avenue was particularly significant to not only jazz, but I believe world culture. You know, we have three of the biggest icons in jazz to come out of Indianapolis. Wes Montgomery, who played up and down Indiana Avenue, kind of what you call the definition of jazz guitar. J.J. Johnson, who's from Indianapolis, is kind of the definition of jazz trombone. You look at Freddie Hubbard, he kind of redefined what jazz trumpet was from the late 50s on. Those three and so many more great musicians that kind of came out of Indiana Avenue and became world famous just speaks volumes to the excellence that it was producing. I worked with Jimmy Coe and his big band. Jimmy Coe was kind of like the king of the jazz scene on Indiana Avenue. He was a person that didn't ever leave Indianapolis. 15, 16 years later, I worked with Melvin Ryan and recorded a record. Melvin Ryan is a great B3 organ player that played with the Wes Montgomery Trio. It was not only great to just work with a fantastic organ player, just to hear stories about when they got signed to a national label, how it all happened, how Wes not only became jazz famous, but internationally famous when he got signed with A&M Records. He had all these great stories. Working with him, working with Killer Ray Appleton, who also a great drummer from Indianapolis that worked on the Avenue that moved to New York. It's great to take a jazz history course, but when you can hear it firsthand from people that were there, that were actually making the history, it means that much more, and you kind of feel that much more part of the legacy. Jazz started out a singular place, New Orleans, and then moved to Chicago, Kansas City, Indianapolis, and then New York. A lot of people say, well, I don't know if I really understand jazz. And I'm like, man, if you just understood that this music is kind of our connective tissue of American music. If you like rock and roll, then it's influenced from jazz. If you like Motown, those were jazz musicians putting jazz chords on kind of like R&B tunes. Indiana Avenue particularly had a great contribution into shaping the direction of that music.
I started playing pool on the Avenue when I was about 18 years old. There was a lot of black players on the Avenue, a lot of guys that, they played for money. That's one of the things that drew a crowd, because people would make a little money playing, whereas nowadays they just play with no money at all, but just for the game, the sport of the game. You can make a lot of money playing pool, and that's what interested a lot of guys back then, because you could always put money in your pocket just by playing pool, and that kept you out of trouble. You wouldn't have to steal and rob and that, because you can play pool for money and make up the difference between just shooting and doing illegal stuff. Just being in the pool room, talking to different players, sharing your community skills with other players there. Everybody liked each other. It was just a good gathering point for people. They done tore down a lot of pool rooms that was on the Avenue back then. I wish there was a lot more pool rooms on the Avenue, because it would give people something to do.
There have been many changes on the avenue, but those changes erased the Black community. Now, the Indiana Avenue area is quite diverse, but that doesn't mean that the history should not be shared with the people who currently live there. I think in doing that history and teaching the newcomers to that area, the people, the students from IUPUI, the new downtown residents, this history is just as important for them to know as it is for African American young people to know, because therein lies the ability to have a respect for people.
When you know that there's people here who have contributed
To the success of our city, our community, there is a level of respect. It's not through any fault of African Americans that the Avenue has become a community that is no longer within the control of the Black community. There were a number of forces that converged to create what we now have. The Black Heritage Preservation Program's purpose is to uncover, document, preserve, and share the history of Black heritage sites and history throughout Indiana. The Indiana Avenue revitalization efforts, I don't believe, have started in the sense of revitalizing it to any semblance of what it used to be for the African American community. We hope to, at least as an organization of preservation, restore the memory of the history of that location through some of the technological tools that we're using to capture that history.